It's been over 3 years ago that I covered the topic of mass assignment and how it can be such a huge security vulnerability. Now with Rails 3 on the scene, there are a lot of securities enabled by default, but this is one area which is not. Mass assignment attributes still need to be heavily protected in order to avoid setting attributes by users that you don't want to be set. Now, if you aren't familiar with this problem, then I encourage you to check out episode number 26 here for more details. But basically it boils down to this. Whenever you're doing mass assignment, just make sure that you have an attribute accessible call in your model. Otherwise, the user is able to set any attribute in the model, which can lead to huge security problems. So it seems easy enough to just add this to every model, but there's two major problems I've come across when doing so. The first one is when testing. Sometimes you want to just mass assign a lot of different attributes, and this can be limiting. One solution to that is to use factories, like I show in episode 158, and that is really a great way to go. Now, the other issue I've had is that this adder accessible call is not dynamic. That means that it's pretty much set in stone in the class, and if we want to change the attributes that are accessible based off of the user's current permissions, that's really difficult to do. At least it was in Rails 2, but Rails 3 gives us a new way to make this dynamic, and that's what I want to show you in this episode. Let me show you a concrete example of what I mean. So let's say we have a wiki site where we have many articles, and a given article can be edited by anyone. So we can edit an article here, and then we have our form. Now I have this checkbox here where we can mark an article as important, and when we do, it just makes the title red. But I only want articles to be labeled as important if the user is an administrator. So if the user is not an administrator, they should not be able to mark articles as important. So they don't want to, we don't want that field to be accessible to other users. Now it's easy enough to just go into our form view for our article here and then hide this important checkbox if the user isn't an admin. So if the user is an admin, then we'll display our checkbox here. But this is just a client-side change. We're not changing anything on the server side, and it's still possible for the client to bypass this even though the field is not visible. So changing this won't really solve our problem here, so I'm going to leave it as is, even though in the real world you would want to hide the checkbox when the user isn't an admin. Now the real issue goes deeper into the controller and model layers, specifically the create and update actions here, because that's where the assignment is taking place. So if we wanted to protect that important attribute here, we would have to go through our params hash and delete our important attribute from the article params unless the user is an admin. So that way we'll make sure that other users, this will just be ignored. But we'll have to remember to do this for every kind of attribute we want to protect, and there's really no correlation with the adder accessible call in the model. Instead, it would be nice if we could make the adder accessible call dynamic. So let's check out the API docs for Rails 3 and see if we can find anything. By the way, if you want earlier versions of Rails, the docs for those, you can get it with specifying the version after api.rubyonrails.org, such as 238, and that'll take you to that documentation. But we want Rails 3 here because that's what we're on. So let me search for adder accessible. There it is. Now what's really interesting about this is that adder accessible is now inside active model, not directly active record, which means you can include it into any class you want and then use it there. This makes it much more flexible, and also at the top of this it gives you an example of using this inside of a controller directly instead of going through the model, which is a really neat idea. But what I want to get from this bit of code here is this little nugget here. And this is basically showing you how to make adder accessible dynamic by overriding the assignment authorizer. As you can see here, it has some changing the behavior based on if the user is an admin or not. So that means inside our model, we can override this little method to change our behavior. So here's what our article model looks like. As you can see, it's really simple, just with an adder accessible call with those three attributes. But this important attribute here at the end, this is what I want to make dynamic. And we can do so by overriding that method. So let's make it a private method here, and it's called mass assignment authorizer. So if we call super inside of here, that'll just give us our old behavior, which is returning what's called a whitelist sanitizer. And you don't really need to be familiar with how that works. All you need to know is that you can add more attributes to this with a simple plus call. So we can say important, and that will add important to our whitelist. So that means we can remove it from here, and this will basically mimic that same behavior, but now we can make it dynamic because notice that this is now an instance method and not done in the class level. So let's make this dynamic by adding a variable and allowing us to change it. So let me add a rewrite accessor here, and let's call it just accessible. And then we can use this inside of here. So let's just say it's the accessible option or an empty array. And then we can use this inside of our controller. So inside the update action here, before we do our mass assignment, let's set the accessible option to, it's called important, if the user is an admin. And that way he should be able to access that. Alright, now let's try this out. I'm currently not marked as an admin, so if I try to edit this article and then choose important, and the text hasn't changed, and notice the field hasn't changed. So it didn't allow us to set that value in the update action. Now if I edit my profile here and make myself an admin, and then try to change it, I'm able to mark that article as important. Now ideally, admins should be able to edit anything, so it would be nice if we also supported an option called all, where any attribute would be allowed. So back to our model, we need to add a check inside this mass assignment authorizer to see if our accessible is equal to all, and then change our behavior. Otherwise, we'll fall back to using the old attribute accessible. Now it would be nice if we could just return a simple empty array here, but unfortunately the object that is returned by this is a little bit special. It's a special sanitizer object. And to get around this problem, here's a little bit of a hack, but it works pretty well, and that is to return self class protected attributes. And this is something that's used by that mass assignment security module in Active Model to basically, it's a blacklist object which sanitizes based off of protected attributes. But since we're not using attribute protected here, it's basically going to allow all attributes. So it's just what we wanted here. And we could test this out in the controller, and we can see that admins still have the ability to update the important attribute. Now inside of the controller, we also need to apply this accessible option to our create action as well. And if we just add this line here, it won't work because mass assignment happens before this in the new call here. So we need to actually move the mass assignment down here, say attributes equals the article parameters. And that way it happens after this accessible call. Now you may want to make this behavior more abstract and remove the duplication between these two actions, but that's sort of dependent on how your permission system works, and I'll leave that up to you. But what I do want to show you is back in the model, and that is how to make this behavior abstract and make it apply to all models by just overriding active records behavior. So let's actually move this into an initializer. So under the config initializers directory, let's add a new file here called accessible attributes. And then you could just paste in the behavior into here and then change the class to active record base so it applies to everything. And the only other line we need to change here is this add accessible call. Now you could remove this entirely, but another alternative is just to remove the arguments to this. And what that means is that by default, everything will not have access to be set through mass assignment, and you'll need to add another adder accessible call to each model to make them accessible through mass assignment. So then back inside our article, we can clean this up by just stripping out everything else except adder accessible. And that's it for this episode. That's how you can make adder accessible completely dynamic and change its attributes based on the user's permissions. Now what I like about this approach is that everything is locked down by default and access is only granted where we specify it in the code. So this makes mass assignment security issues not nearly as big of a problem because by default it is secure.